This week, welcome. Today's session, we're going to talk about trauma-informed practices in teacher preparation. We have some folks here who are from Metropolitan State University of Denver. I'm going to go ahead and give them a chance to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Anna.
Hi, everyone. So I'll introduce myself and then share screen. So my name is Anna Joseph. I direct the Trauma Informed Practices Initiative at MSU Denver. My background is in mental health and social work and public health. And it's really great to be here today.
Thanks, Anna. And how about Kathryn?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathryn Young at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And I teach in secondary education, but I also help with Anna and Ofelia run our trauma-informed practices curriculum integration project. We call ourselves the TIP team. If you hear us saying that, that's how we think about ourselves. And yeah, happy to be here. Happy to have you all here and looking forward to a great conversation.
Thank you so much. And Ofelia.
Yeah, Ofelia Schepers at MSU Denver, Associate Professor of Elementary Education and Literacy, and have been deeply ingrained in the TIP integration of the School of Education.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. We're glad to see everybody here. Anna and Kathryn, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you all to take us away.
That's Anna figuring out how to share her screen right now. Or not?
No, I just realized I am so sorry. We did two presentations today and I opened and prepared the wrong one to share. Let me just close that out and then share the correct one. My apologies. I had it all ready to go and then.
Wait, look, you're just getting nodding heads, Anna. That's happens to all of us.
I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. Give me 1 second.
And we also have Kathy. I'm going to call you out. If you see Kathy Whitmore's name, she's a chair of one of our departments in the School of Education. So she might, as we talk and have, if you all have ideas and questions, Kathy, you might be a good resource as well in the background.
And I got this here. Give me just 1 second. Again, so sorry. My brain has not been as focused as it should be. And I downloaded the wrong one. So let me just get this all set up and we should be good to go. Okay, here we are. Let me just do the full set. There we go. Thanks everybody so much. My apologies. That was embarrassing. So thanks for bearing with me with that one.
So as we talk about trauma-informed practices and teacher preparation, we are gonna talk a little bit about what they are just for a shared definition purpose. And then we also are gonna have a Padlet going so that you could share with us in the Padlet and we can make a shared document all together. So just know that that's also a part of this. And then we're also hoping that you talk out loud with us about your thoughts and ideas, strategies and limitations, constraints as well. And if you go to the next slide. So we are going to share a little bit about what, not we as a royal we, but like what the literature knows about trauma, and it'll be, kind of a quick and dirty version of it. A little bit about trauma and equity, and then really we want to focus on trauma-informed practices TIP and teacher preparation. That's where we'll spend the bulk of our time today. And then what specifically we're doing as part of our TIP initiative at MSU Denver. Yep, next slide.
And now I'm seeing that it looks like y'all are seeing kind of the presenter view and not the full slide. So let me do that. There we go. Is everyone seeing now the slide, just the full slide? Okay, perfect. I think we finally got this figured out. Thanks everybody so much. So why are we talking about trauma-informed practices in schools? Children spend so much of their life and so many hours in schools. It really makes sense in a sort of obvious point of intervention for creating healing focused and trauma-informed environments for students who've experienced trauma, and all students. And I think also knowing that so much trauma can take place in schools themselves, making sure that we have trauma-informed environments in schools can prevent, hopefully, the trauma that often happens to students in schools from happening in the first place. So things we know about trauma. We know that students who have experienced trauma, we see kind of on a broad scale, can have higher risk for poor academic outcomes, long-term health outcomes, and then struggles with anxiety, emotion regulation, self-esteem. And we also know that schools that respond to trauma and integrate trauma-informed practices have seen reduced, sort of, I think the literature was calling it like delinquency behaviors, however you feel about that, that term, and improved academic outcomes. And we're also seeing that teachers aren't really feeling prepared necessarily to build trauma-informed environments. 1 and 2 don't feel prepared to recognize signs of trauma in their students, and 7 of 10 don't feel prepared to implement trauma-informed teaching as either. So when we think and talk about trauma-informed practices, I know this is a lot, so don't feel like you kind of have to read this whole thing, but we like to kind of put this here, and this is something we can share with folks afterwards. So if you're interested, let us know or put that in the chat. But when we talk about trauma-informed practices, really broadly, we're talking about a set of practices, policies, procedures that respond to the needs of students who have experienced trauma. And there are many different sort of models for trauma-informed practices. The one that we have been using at the School of Education is called HEARTS. That stands for Healthy Environments in Response to Trauma in Schools. And I can also put that link in the chat at the end as well. And Ofelia or Kathryn, one of my colleagues, be able to real quickly, but the HEARTS model really breaks trauma-informed practices down into these principles that we have on the left-hand side. So these are the kind of things we want to be embodying in our trauma-informed environments. So I won't kind of go through and read all this, but essentially, understanding trauma and stress. What is trauma? What is stress? How does it impact learning and behavior? Acknowledging the presence of insidious and racial trauma and responding to it, and having equitable teaching practices. Building safe and predictable environments that can be really, really important for students, coming as students with compassion and dependability, providing opportunities to build resilience and social emotional learning skills, and providing opportunities for voice and choice, kind of in that empowerment and collaboration section there. I think kind of a broad view lens of trauma-informed practices that can be helpful when thinking about what they are, is sort of thinking about this lens that we are viewing student behavior, and taking that lens from looking at a student, especially if they're acting in a way that we find frustrating or confusing, of saying, what's wrong with that student, and taking it instead to saying, what's happened to that student, right? What things have happened to their lives to lead someone to act a certain way? Oftentimes, especially for those of us who have experienced trauma, the ways that we respond to behave and act in certain situations are really survival skills that we had to learn due to trauma that we've experienced. So those are kind of big overview. Anything to add, Kathryn, Ofelia, before I go ahead? Or
I would just add that we did make a change to from the original HEARTS model on the insidious racial trauma and equity, to really capture for us the equity and justice foundation that we work from.
And, when we think about teacher preparation, right, all of us are in this strange dual role where we're teaching our students and we're also preparing them to be teachers. And so when we look at these guiding principles, we think about them as, how do we model them in our own classrooms with our own students? How do we then teach our students about these trauma-informed practices so that they will hopefully enact these practices with their students once they become teachers? And so we're always mindful of this dual role of us as teachers, but us as also preparing teachers. And so when we talk about curriculum integration, we mean it in this dual way. We mean, like, we don't just want people teaching the content, because if you teach this content, but you don't teach in trauma-informed ways yourself, that's going to be a real disconnect, right? And we know so much of what we model for our students matters for who and how they become as teachers. And so that there's always this dual thing happening in teacher preparation. And so when we talk about curriculum integration within our teacher preparation courses, we mean it at these two different levels.
I'll add too, I think sometimes when talking about trauma-informed practices, it's helpful to think about what trauma-informed practices are not. And I think the things that kind of come to mind there are that trauma-informed practices are not about kind of not having limits or not having boundaries, actually, especially for students, whether it's college students, adults, pre-K through 12 students who have experienced trauma. Actually, limits and boundaries are helpful because they help us feel safe. It's about putting limits and boundaries in a compassionate, dependable, and predictable way, and not doing in a punitive or reactionary way. Also, and I know we'll kind of talk more about this shortly, but that trauma-informed practices are not about kind of just focusing on interpersonal trauma, but it's also really important to look at systemic trauma, historical trauma, racial and insidious trauma as well. And that's a key piece. And we kind of firmly come from the standpoint that if you're not talking about equity and you're not talking about those types of traumas, then you're not doing trauma-informed practices. And I think the last thing is that trauma-informed practices can often be misconstrued to sort of be about like saving or fixing students. And folks kind of have this attitude of like, oh, these students come in and these poor students, they've had all this trauma and we need to fix them or save them. But really trauma-informed practices are about building healing, safe, dependable, engaging environments for students. And those type of environments are really beneficial for all students, particularly students who've experienced trauma. And those environments are key to making sure, again, that we don't end up re-traumatizing students and that schools no longer become an institution that cause trauma for students.
So trauma and equity. So one of the things that we highlight in our trauma-informed practices, and I think I spoke a little bit of how ours shifts a little from the Hearts model, is that we really think about how the trauma caused by schools and teachers disproportionately impacts students from low-income communities and communities of color, right? So while ACEs, which I want to not have the acronym on there, but I can't think of what the ACEs means, so you'll have to pop in, are higher in the communities. So teachers who work with these communities need this lens, because what often happens, and I think we really spoke to this, was that there is the savior mentality often in schools by teachers that end up causing trauma to students as well. And there's also trauma around how we test students, how we track students, and thinking about those points of pain and points of trauma for students as well. And really moving away from this pathologizing of students. So it always seems like any initiative that comes up and continues to be developed often is taken up as a way to group students and say those students. And often this pathology of students ends up disproportionately impacts students of color, even though we know that trauma impacts students from any background. And so, really thinking for us, for our pre-service teachers, is how there's a risk of making assumptions about students and imposing trauma themselves. And so, we don't need students to tell us all of their traumas. We really just focus on trauma-informed practices as a tool that supports all students and a framework that really supports all students, so that we can, avoid this re-traumatization of students, and really, again, focusing on how TIP is really a lens and a framework that is beneficial for all students, whether or not they've gone through trauma.
So we wanted to go back to the objectives that have been shared about what this, this session is about. And we really are hoping that at the end of the hour together that you'll have one strategy to incorporate into your own trauma-informed space, whether it's the classroom, whether you're a director or a chair or something like that. Like, what's one thing that you think you could take away and do tomorrow, or one thing that you're doing but maybe hadn't named as trauma-informed. And we've noticed that a lot of the trauma-informed work is, a lot of it's the naming of the trauma-informed work of good work that people are already doing. And then also thinking through one way to model or connect trauma-informed practices to culturally responsive teaching. If you look at the literature on trauma-informed practices and you look at the literature on culturally responsive teaching, there is a huge overlap, although not quite the same. And, I think when those of us who teach about culturally responsive teaching, we're like, this is good for everybody. This isn't just good teaching for students of color. And we feel very much the same way about many of the trauma-informed practices as well, that students who haven't experienced big T traumas can also benefit from having experiences with trauma-informed practices. So I'm going to put into the Padlet or into the chat a link to the Padlet, and I wanted to share with you what this is. So if you haven't used Padlet yet, where the little plus sign is, you just that's where new stuff is going to show up. And in the bottom, that's where you click and you'll be able to add your ideas. So if we think about right now, either out loud or in the chat or in the Padlet, or all three if you'd like, about where do you think trauma-informed practices might show up in your educational spaces? And we really want to hear from you. Where do you think safety and dependability shows up? Where does compassion show up? Where does learning about insidious and racial trauma or trauma in the brain show up at where you work? And maybe even before we do that, if we could just hear real quick from people, the participants here, just what you do, what your role is, where you are, and that way we can also speak to that a little bit better. And if you're not willing, just let us know. Brooke, Karsten, would you just tell us what you do?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was having a hard time with unmute for some reason. I am an assistant dean of instruction at Colorado Mountain College, and I also teach in our education department. I'm a former middle school teacher.
Lovely. Carrie Maffoni, and if I said your name wrong, please correct me.
Yep,
So I get it
nope,
right.
you're right. Right, rhymes with macaroni and bologna. So
you've said that a lot in life, I bet.
So I work at Regis University. I'm the director of state and school partnerships. And but having come to Regis a year ago, September, and before that, I was a lifer in Jeffco as a teacher, instructional coach, central administrator. And so really today I'm here just to gather ideas and kind of to understand what other universities are doing in this space, because just here to learn. So thank you.
Super. Well, happy to have you. Deborah Mortensen.
Hi, yes, I'm Deb Mortensen. I direct our teacher ed programs at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. So I work with all of our future teachers, but a lot of our students here at Colorado College are interested in education in different contexts, advocacy, research, curriculum, policy. So I get to work with both our future classroom teachers as well as those who are just thinking out education from a social justice lens as a general rule. So yeah, and just recently we've had students who are said to us, like, we would really like some professional development around trauma-informed practices. So
Nice.
This is perfect timing. So thank you.
Excellent. Kathy Whitmore. Let's see.
Sorry, I'm working on the buttons. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Whitmore. Happy to see you. I'm the chair of one of the departments in the School of Education at Metropolitan State University.
Super, thanks. And Stacy Bailey.
Hi, I'm up north here at University of Northern Colorado. I train secondary education, English language arts teachers, and my area of research is social emotional learning and trauma-informed teaching practices. And that's the focus of the methods class that I'm teaching this semester actually as well.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of good collaboration here. So when you all think about trauma-informed practices in your spaces, where do you think they show up or could show up?
I guess I'll jump in. And I'm sure it's not specific to CC, but we are just seeing a lot of our college students struggling with mental health struggles and their own experiences. And fortunately at CC, we do have a culture where we encourage our students to share. But it's a hard balance. And so as faculty, as staff, how do we compassionately and intentionally support them and make sure that our language, our behaviors, our nonverbal, how are we doing that well? And so that translates to our teacher and students who, of course, they go into the K-12 classroom, and some of those students don't have the same way to verbalize and to share in the same ways. And so maybe there's acting out.
Mm-hmm.
Students, there's always something going on. Let's not assume that a student is just being bad for being bad. And I think that's some of the conversations we have with our teacher candidates is, what's wrong with them? Like, there's not necessarily something wrong with them, and that's not the right language to use. So how do we have different discourse and narratives?
Yeah, and so like that would be an example of a trauma-informed practice, is like, it's not what's wrong with you, right? It's like, hey, what's going on? Or making some space, but not too much, right? That idea of like, where are the limits? Where are the boundaries, so that we can even practice our own self-care as teachers ourselves. And we can teach future teachers about sharing, but not oversharing, and sharing for specific purposes, right? And like, why are you telling that story? How does that relate? How is that helping? That all of those things go together in terms of showing vulnerability. And vulnerability can lead to trust. And then, but that oversharing is like, well, that's not appropriate. And then you're putting a huge burden on other people who don't know what to do with all your baggage, right? And that there's a real tension there. What else? What are other people doing in their educational spaces?
I guess to piggyback on that, I guess I've heard right, this fine balance of when, again, the outpouring of students and needing support or asking for extensions, for assignments and grace. And so we've had a lot of conversation of, what does it mean? What does grace really mean? And is it the lowering of expectations, or is it a differentiated approach based on student need? And so to piggyback on what Deborah said, was really just the care and concern for students. And it's when you come from a university that relies heavily on affiliate faculty, communication is a challenge, right, across, so there is some consistency. So that's probably been our biggest, is just, really trying to understand what's happening out in the field. And it's a crazy year, so.
And it's a crazy year, period, right?
Exclamation point.
Exclamation point, right? And how do we do that and still say, I still need you to learn this stuff. You're still going to become a teacher, and you know what? And you're still going to experience engaging with kids in really impactful ways. As an aside, Ofelia and I have done some research related to the trauma-informed practice trainings that we offer through our partner Resilient Futures. And what we found is a slight reduction in secondary traumatic stress. So the stress we experience by listening to other people's trauma, or being in close proximity, that the trainings seem, at least on an early pilot study, seem to be reducing some of that, so that they maybe can learn some self-care strategies and some boundaries, and like and we can't fix people and we can't save people, but we can make environments a lot more conducive to learning. Yeah, Anna, do you want to go ahead and share some more? And so as we talk, and somebody had asked in the chat, so feel free if you want to put things in the chat. We're not a huge group, so if people want to put it on the Padlet, feel free. And if not, we'll just keep an eye on everything, because sometimes one space feels better than another. And then, Anna, if you could go to the next slide. So what we have found already is the importance of TIP in teacher preparation. We also have a second, we have a Spencer study going on people in their first 3 years of teaching, and the first group met this past week, and they already are like, we're first year teachers, we're freaking out, we're not getting a lot of support. And even though school districts are trying to give support, they're like, we're swimming, we're not feeling a lot of support. And so no one prepares me for the traumas the students have experienced. What's it mean to be ready for teaching from a trauma-informed lens? We also know that districts across the board are doing a lot of trauma-informed practices in schools, and teacher prep, we haven't necessarily infused as much as we could be into our programs. So they're often having to learn it on the fly as they become new teachers. I talked about the addressing secondary traumatic stress. We are hoping that if they do have less secondary traumatic stress, maybe that will lead to lower burnout. We don't know, but we're hoping that becomes something that's true. And then also, people need resources to know where to go for themselves and for their students. And that trauma-informed practices, as Anna was saying earlier, really supports culturally responsive teaching as well. Next slide, please.
So how we've taken it up in our School of Education, we have various implementation components, and it really began with us working individually with faculty in all of our departments to work on the curriculum integration. And this really relied on a few things. So we also began, parallel to that was our partner, Resilient Futures, would do student trainings, and it was a 4-part student training that some of our faculty attended. And so through that process, we really got to know the foundations of hearts and how we can take it up in the curriculum of our faculty and program curriculum. And so part of that led to faculty and staff development in trauma-informed practices. And through that process, we selected individuals who wanted to be trained as official hearts trainers, and then mentor teachers development in trauma-informed practices. So those that weren't trained in that, like facilitating mentorship through that. And, really for us, it's really thinking about how we can sustain it in the School of Education, that curriculum integration, and also ways that we can do it through, for instance, we are launching this summer our Masters in Curriculum and Instruction with a focus on trauma-informed practices. So that's a cohort modeled CNI degree. And really for our undergrads, we're really looking about how can we ensure that there's enough trauma-informed practices within the classes that they're taking, that it could count towards a certificate in trauma-informed practices for them, and really support them on the job market, but also really support their teaching practices. And then on the outskirts of that is really maintaining our community partnerships, not only with our Resilient Futures, but really school partnerships. And then research and evaluation, both of the integration, how it's working, how it's being impactful, as well as really thinking about following teachers who have done our 4-part series or have gotten a certificate when we get to that point. And for us, it's also thinking about what's next after we do this. How do we move forward and continue to push forward to ensure that trauma-informed practices are a solid component of what we teach in the School of Education.
So one of the was going to say the biggest, but that's not true. Every aspect of that slide before is really big. So in terms of curriculum integration, we really, nothing works top down. Like if the state tells you to do things, you do those things. But this isn't a state mandate, right, at this point. And so if we value trauma-informed practices and we want the students, like the standalone trainings are great, but we really need infusions so that students don't see trauma-informed practices as an add-on. They see it part and parcel of every one of our classes. And so we have all these things we've been doing to try to support individual faculty, individual courses that might have several different faculty teach different sections of them, and then individual programs. So like early childhood as a program, secondary as a program, how do we support the different groups? And honestly, it has, it's looked different for every single group, and that's probably going to be our biggest takeaway. But what we found is when there has been reticence or like, I'm already full up, my curriculum's already full up, my time's already full up, that when we've offered individual consultations, just like one-on-one, hey, Ofelia, do you want me to sit down with you and talk about your class? We're all teachers. We love talking about teaching. And so Ofelia, Anna, and I, or some part of us, would meet with individual faculty and be like, hey, tell us about your class. And really what we did would say, hey, do you know that's a trauma-informed practice? That's collaboration. And so people would say, oh, I already talked about collaboration. And what we found early on is lots of people did lots of these things, but didn't connect the language to trauma-informed practices. So let's say they were going out, new teachers were going out to get a job. You'd say, hey, do you know anything about trauma-informed practice? They'd be like, no, I've never heard of it, but I know all about collaboration. I know all about empathy. I know all about culture responsive teaching, right? And so that making explicit, because novices often don't pick up on implicit messages if you look at the novice expert research. So one of the biggest things we can do for our students is we can name things. When I'm being compassionate with the class right now, that's an example of a trauma-informed practice. And when people act through compassion, they lower stress. And when you lower stress, you make learning easier, right? And so by just doing a few little touch points, faculty could see how trauma-informed practices were really all over their classes already. And some of it was switching naming or co-naming, like this is a culturally responsive practice, and this is a trauma-informed practice, and this is why, and this is how it relates to stress, and this is how it relates to trauma. And this is why it might work for any student in your classroom. So we had a lot of these individual conversations, these one-on-ones, and people got all excited and they were putting trauma-informed practices into their curriculum. We'd also, we have a resource bank and we just send 2 or 3 resources, again, not to overwhelm. And then we'd have small group consultations. So if 3 people teach the exact same class, like a multicultural class, we would meet with that small group. And we have some tip learning objectives that we created based on the HEARTS model. So we have these learning objectives. And we say, hey, which of these show up in your course? Do they show up a little bit, somewhat, or a lot? And then we would talk through all the different instructors of a course with the eventual goal of putting these into official course syllabi, because at Metro, that's a big deal. And that's where, if you get it into there, it'll live kind of forever until somebody else switches it. And so that's a way, if you have a lot of affiliates or adjuncts, for us, that's the way to have sustainability within coursework. And then we know there's content training. We all need to build our own capacity, and we don't all have huge capacity in all of these areas. And so we have these student trainings that we can go to as well. Alumni, students who are now teachers, they can come back to. We have this resource bank, so we're really trying to also build people's individual expertise, because you can't incorporate anything into your class if you don't know anything about it. And then the process is more about how are we doing what we're doing and how is it building across each of the programs. And then we have this train the trainer, where 20 of us, faculty who are content methods specialists, as well as more generalists, came together over the course of the year and did a 10-part series with the Resilient Futures people. So to build our own capacity so that we could be supports for our colleagues. And really this organic nature, and people are like, well, do you want us to fill that form or not? We're like, well, the form helps these people, but those people don't like the form. These people like the spreadsheet. These people just like to chat. And so really with every single group, we have been doing this work differently, although we have, a small handful of resources that we keep using over and over and over again. Ofelia or Anna, did you have more you wanted to fill in about that?
You got it.
Okay, next slide. So really, this idea, we review where people are at, we have them plan, they try it out, we come talk to them again. And Anna's really good at this. Every time we meet with a group, she'll say, hey, let's get the next meeting on the calendar. And maybe the meeting's in 2 weeks, maybe it's in 2 months, or maybe it's in March. But that we plan the next time we're going to chat at the time we're chatting now. And really it's like, how are you doing? What help do you need? What resources do you need? And often it's really just time for faculty to talk about their classes. Like, it's the rocket science part is making the time, right? Which is so hard for so many of us. And then the comprehensive integration is we've been taking the TIP learning objectives from each of these individual classes, and we've been putting them on this like spreadsheet and making like a quilt. So early childhood has their own quilt of trauma-informed practices. Elementary ed has their own quilt of trauma-informed practices. So they can see like, okay, we are touching on them a lot here. We're doing deep dives in some of these areas. We probably need deep dives in some of these areas as well. And so they can see, you can see your own course in relation to all the other courses that students would take. So by the time they finish, they would feel like they can say, yes, I've learned a lot about trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please.
And so we talked a little bit about this on the overview of really where we're going, but really the ideal portion would be that that trauma-informed practices would be so deeply integrated into the curriculum of each department, really hitting on each of the 6 pillars of the HEARTS model, to the point where we feel comfortable and confident that they have those tools to give them a certificate when they finish. And this was incredibly important for us, especially with the legislation that came down where, you know, teachers were gonna have to have X amount of hours in behavioral, I forget the terms they use, but trauma-informed practices and culturally responsive pedagogy would really be embedded in that facet. And then thinking through the master's of curriculum and instruction with a core of leadership, equity, and responsiveness. And for us specifically, this concentration in trauma-informed practices. And when we were developing this over the last 2 years, a large focus of ours, again, was really embedded in equity and how each of the classes that they took really attended to equity in these parts. So when we talk about trauma and stress, we also want to ensure that we're not pathologizing students. And what does that look like? What is the literature? How does it inform it? And really thinking through bringing in those facets into each of those courses.
So when we think about, when we think about trauma-informed practices at your institutions, we just like a few minutes to hear from you all, like what you're already doing, what you're thinking you might be able to do, and also maybe what constraints might get in the way, you know, just to hear what different places are doing or thinking of doing if not doing at this point. And really, there are not that many of us here, so I think each of you could just take the floor and talk about it for a few. And if you want, I'm happy to call on people like I do in my classes.
I'll go.
Okay.
No, I think the first thing that resonated with me was the naming of trauma-informed practices as being intersected with culturally responsive teaching. And in our program, that has been our focus, embedded in every single class, is equity, social justice, culturally responsive teaching. But I don't think we've named trauma-informed practices in such a specific way. And I think that there's a real value to that. So that's the first thing that came. I was like, oh yeah, we need to be more intentional about those, the way they intersect and complement and are super supportive of each other. And those best practices are best practices for all students.
Yeah, and Deb, I'll tell you, we, so Ofelia and I both teach multicultural classes. And then students went to some of these trainings. And in our multicultural classes, we talk about implicit bias, as do most multicultural classes that I know of. Our students go to these trainings and they learn about implicit bias. And there's a survey that says have you ever heard of implicit bias before? And like to a T, they're like, nope, never, ever heard of it. And we were both like,
You're like, were you in the same class?
oh my God. I mean, it was so upsetting. It was so upsetting. But really, it's because they learned about it over there with that stuff, and novices don't transfer, right? Like knowledge, acquisition and then transfer is where it matters. But novices need help with that transfer, and just how important that is. And so that naming aspect and really explicitly naming is making such a difference. And it's low hanging fruit. Like we can all do the naming.
Right. So that to me was like okay, I just on my little sticky note.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our biggest advice to people. We're like, you want to do one thing? Name stuff. Stacy?
I'm muted. Yeah, as you two are talking, I'm thinking the exact same things about transfer. There's so many courses that our teacher candidates take that all come together for this large, preparing you to be a teacher. And yet they're not bringing those concepts over from one to the other. So one of the things that we've started doing recently, just last year here at UNC, is bringing some of the ed psych components over to our methods courses, right? And some of the special education concepts over to our methods courses, and actually requiring our teacher candidates to write lesson plans, write your lesson plan according to Colorado, based on Colorado academic standards for English language arts, and include an element of social emotional learning. So, you learned last semester the basics of lesson planning for your content area. Now, keep those evidence outcomes and add an evidence outcome from social emotional learning. And, add the WIDA differentiation, right? So we're actually requiring them to demonstrate their ability to scaffold, because when we asked them to, they were not doing it. And when we would talk to them about it, they weren't doing it. And so we revised our lesson plan format. Jerry did, she's on this call, and required it on there so that they understand, like, you have to do this to pass. And then they rose to the occasion beautifully. It was, it's touching really to see them go, oh, okay, we can do that. And it's not rocket science, right? But it was really beautiful to see them actually doing those things and seeing the value in it and demonstrating their ability to do it.
100%. Other people, what you're up to, what you wish would be up to, what's in your way from being up to things?
I'm thinking about the, kind of integration, or just the cross section anyway of trauma-informed practice and culturally responsive teaching, and how important it is, like you said, about the students from low income and communities of color often score higher on the ACEs. And I just think how important that is for candidates to understand, maybe some of the roots of the things that you might be seeing in the classroom, and just how important it would be, just to understand how it all overlaps. I'm thinking too, Jerry's a part of a community of practice that we have around family, school, and community engagement. And I'm thinking about how that overlaps too, and how it's just so tightly interwoven, and, bringing it all together is so important for candidates. And I'm just, been a big fan of this work for a long time, and just am so, thrilled to see how you've really blown it up at Metro. And again, how we might be able to cross-pollinate the work into some, other things we're doing, like you're talking about, just using the different language, using the words, and, making sure that this transfer shows up more explicitly for teachers. I'll just stop there for a minute. I just love it.
Yeah, I'll say and call to Britt too, who's been kind of involved and aware of this work even from before I was at Metro. So Britt's kind of been with us and at it and supporting us from the beginning. So thank you.
And I guess, Britt, just to build on what you're talking about, the family school community partnerships, is yesterday morning at the keynote, there was a story about how a principal or how a school district introduced their teacher candidates to the district they were going to be teaching in. And they were driving around in a police car, and the officer was pointing out, am I right here, Britt, right? Pointing out, here's the crack houses, here's the this, and that deficit-minded perspective. I was not crying, but I was about crying. I was like, this is the worst way to support our teachers and to prepare for them for these communities that they're going to be working in. And I was just like, it was, so just to connect that whole piece about the families and the communities and trauma-informed practice and cultural responsibility, it's all so interwoven, but that story was horrifying. That's how this particular district introduced their teacher candidates to this school. And I thought that was so sad. So sad.
I was thinking about that too, Deb. And there was also another story, or just I'm making a connection to a man in our department was talking about last week about he was eligible for some resources being a first generation college student. And I was thinking about the, the information that you were talking about on that first slide about accidentally traumatizing students. And he, after a while looked around and he's like, wait a minute, this is code for poor immigrants. And how then he didn't want to participate in any of these resources because then he saw it as embarrassing when actually they were offering these supports to try to help him. And so again, the microaggressions or unintentional consequences that are created and the trauma created by the schools, even with, maybe good intentions or somewhat what they think are the best opportunities, just kind of perpetuating these issues.
And I'd like to, really think about what you just said, the trauma perpetuated by schools. And I'm always fearful. So the ACEs, the adverse children experiences, often people will take that up and say, well, I'm going to give it to my students so that I know their trauma, right? And yet that particular piece can be really traumatic to give to students in higher ed, even if you're having them look at it to see what their ACEs would be, thinking about the impact of that so that we don't, re-traumatize students in that way. So even those little facets, just thinking about, I think I'm doing such a great job because I get to know everyone's trauma. And we get to go from that. It's well, it's not about knowing everyone's trauma. It's just about assuming we've all gone through trauma and how do we apply these practices without, feeling like we're asking pre-service teachers to be therapists or social workers or really just saying this is a really great practice and not another pathology, right, to other students. Because I feel like those always get, any initiative gets taken up to pathologize students, specific ones.
Yeah, and I think as the teacher workforce is still so predominantly white, and students are not in Colorado as well as in other states, that sometimes because of our deep socializations, that we want to save those poor kids, right? And that we really have to work with our students, that just because students have lived with some really hard experiences we might not be able to imagine because we haven't experienced them. How do we see their strength? How do we see their resilience? How are schools places that build you up rather than tear you down? And really focusing on how do we say that here is a place that's going to help you thrive rather than a place that shows you everything that's wrong with you. And, and so there is Ofelia and Anna and I talk a lot about this, the danger of trauma-informed practices just being another tool to say, oh, those poor students, right? Like Brittany, like those kids, right? And that we really, that's where culturally responsive teaching, and we think that learning about insidious and racial trauma in relation to be like, there are systems in place that get in the way of people being successful. And then, so what are the policies? What are the practices that that we have at schools and at schools of education that help people thrive? Like, where is there red tape we can get rid of? Where are there just policies for policy's sake that are not useful and actually get in the way of people learning and thriving? And that when we take a closer look at, or even that idea of like, I'm not going to ask somebody to do something because like, oh, they've been through so much. That protectionism, like who do we protect and how do we protect people? Instead of saying to somebody, hey, do you want to do this or not do this? Like, you're in charge of your own body. You're in charge of your own time, that we don't have to protect others. We can ask people where their capacity is. And if they need a little help in getting something done, what does that look like? So really keeping the complexity at the forefront so that we don't reduce people to their trauma as we teach about it. And then as we're teaching people who've experienced traumas, and so that, like, we keep using the words like people have experienced traumas and all people, because we really want to highlight the all people, because you don't know what might have been traumatizing or triggering for somebody. And so then if you just teach in these ways and you name these ways, you can just do a better job in front of all your students. I'm also really mindful of time, and I know we have 5 minutes left. We wanted to show you quick our takeaways, which are, and I like, this is really what we've learned, and it seems a little trite, but it is 100% true. The one size fits all for curriculum integration, we firmly disagree with. That every program is different and needs a different timeline for curriculum integration. Every course is different and needs a different timeline for integration, and that every person is different and needs a different timeline for integration. And, when we've approached people and just said, we trust you and we trust you to know what's best, how can we help you build your capacity and capacity within your classroom and within your program? We have found amazingness. Right? When we just trust our colleagues to be the amazing people that they are, that they know what they don't know, they know what they need. And sometimes they just need a conversation to think things through, that they want this work and they're already doing this work, but they're also going to do more of this work when they're the ones, it's as with anything else, right? Like, student-centered learning really works, and it works with us as well. And that, so that really curriculum integration has to be this organic, messy, not one size fits all version to make it work for the real people that we work with. Oh, sorry, that's my doorbell and it scared the hell out of me. Is there another slide, or is that the last one, Anna?
So, as we grow and learn, I think our continued questions are, how do we keep future teachers from pathologizing students, right? Like, that always comes back to us. We don't want them to lead, and again, other children in a different way. How will our new teachers adapt their TIP practices the longer they're in the field? And will it maintain an equity focus, right? So we can't control the school environments that they go into, but we know that those school environments really impact how they take up curriculum, how they're allowed to take up curriculum in some instances, and the leeway that they might have. And then how can we support student teachers and their mentor teachers in learning about and implementing trauma-informed practices, TIP equity in schools? And will TIP training reduce burnout? So that one, is always on our mind as well. Like, is it impactful for teachers as well as for students? And in what ways?
And definitely, reach out after today. We're definitely hoping, for coalition building and helping each other out along the way with all the good work that you all have been doing, and the conversations that you've shared with us today. And there's Ofelia and my email. If you need Anna's, we can always get that to you as well. And thanks for being with us today.
And thanks all three of you for being here today and leading us through this and giving us a little bit of some insights into the work you've been doing. This has been a really fascinating and rich conversation. So to Anna, to Ofelia, to Kathryn, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate you all being here and all of your hard work. And I think all of us are going to take certainly one or more than one things away from this conversation today. So thank you so very much. And to all of you for being here today and to sharing in the conversation. That's that really added another layer, another element to what we were all talking about here today. So thanks to everybody who was on our session here today. We do have 8 more sessions this week for our convening. So if you haven't looked through the rest of them or registered for some of the others, take a look at that flyer. See if there might be another couple of sessions or maybe 8 of them you want to show up to. We hope that they're all going to be just as good as these first few days have been. So really appreciate all of your time and everything. We'll share out slides and recordings and everything once all this is over. And again, thank you all so much for sharing this time with us today. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll see you all next time. All right.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good day. Thanks so much.